The jet's fuselage tore through the icy river like a knife through silk, and inside, a woman in a $1,000 suit realized that money couldn't buy her next breath. Her fingers clawed at the seatbelt as freezing water rushed around her ankles, then her knees, then her chest. 20 feet above on the riverbank, a man with paint-stained hands and holes in his jacket didn't think. He just dove. What happened next wasn't just a rescue, but shattered 2 worlds. Before we need to go back 6 hours to understand what happened, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Lucas Garcia woke at 5:30 that Tuesday morning, the same way he'd woken every morning for 3 years, to the sound of his daughter coughing in the next room. He lay still for a moment, counting the coughs. 4, 5, 6. When they stopped, he allowed himself to breathe. The apartment was cold. The landlord had promised to fix the heating 2 weeks ago, but promises and fixes lived in different universes when you were late on rent. Lucas pulled on 2 sweaters, both frayed at the cuffs, and walked to Layla's room. She was 7 years old and slept curled like a comma, her breathing shallow but steady. On her nightstand sat 3 things: a glass of water, her inhaler, and a photograph of a woman with Layla's exact smile. Lucas didn't look at the photograph anymore. Looking made his chest feel like someone had reached inside and squeezed. He made breakfast, oatmeal with cinnamon because that's what they could afford, and because Layla said it tasted like clouds might taste if clouds were warm. She ate slowly, talking about a book her teacher had read them. Something about a brave mouse who saved a lion. Lucas listened, nodded, smiled when he was supposed to smile. Inside his head, he was doing math. Rent was $1,200. He had $473. The painting job he'd finished last week still hadn't paid out, and the contractor kept saying, "Next week, definitely next week," in that voice that meant probably never. Layla coughed twice more while putting on her shoes. "Did you use your inhaler this morning?" Lucas asked. She nodded, but her eyes slid sideways the way children's eyes do when they're protecting their parents from worry. He drove her to school in a truck that groaned at every stoplight and smelled permanently of turpentine and regret. Other parents dropped their children off in cars that purred like satisfied cats. Lucas watched them. These people who seemed to move through life with an ease he couldn't remember ever feeling. They didn't check their gas gauge before starting the engine. They didn't buy the dented cans at the grocery store because they were 40 cents cheaper. They existed in a world where problems were inconveniences, not catastrophes. Layla kissed his cheek before running toward the school entrance, her backpack held together with duct tape and hope, bouncing against her small shoulders. Lucas waited until she disappeared through the doors. Then he sat in his truck for 3 full minutes, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, before driving to his next job. The job was downtown, touching up the exterior of a building that housed law offices and consulting firms and other businesses that existed in glass towers above the rest of humanity. Lucas set up his equipment in the cold, his breath making white clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. His hands ached. They always ached now, a dull throb that lived in his knuckles and wrists, payment for years of gripping brushes and rollers and ladders. He was halfway through the second-floor trim when he saw the jet. At first, it was just a sound, a scream of metal that didn't belong in the sky. Lucas looked up, paintbrush frozen mid-stroke. The small private jet was descending too fast, too steep, its trajectory all wrong. Later, investigators would talk about engine failure and emergency protocols, and a pilot who did everything right, but still couldn't prevent what came next. In that moment, though, all Lucas saw was something falling toward the river that cut through the city like a vein. The impact was both quieter and louder than movies had taught him to expect. The jet hit the water at an angle, nose first, and the sound was a deep, terrible crunch that Lucas felt in his sternum. Then chaos, water erupting, metal shrieking, People on the riverbank screaming and pointing and doing that thing humans do when confronted with catastrophe. Freezing. Lucas didn't freeze. He dropped the paintbrush. It fell 12 feet and splattered on the sidewalk below, leaving a starburst of cream-colored paint that would still be there 3 months later when everything else had changed. He climbed down the ladder so fast, his boots barely touched the rungs. Other people were running toward the crash. Lucas ran faster. The jet was sinking. He could see it from the riverbank, the tail tilting up as the nose went down. Water pouring through the broken fuselage like the river was hungry. Through a window, cracked but not shattered, he saw her. A woman. Dark hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with the specific terror that comes from watching your own death approach in slow motion. She was fighting with her seatbelt, fingers slipping on the metal clasp, and the water was rising. Rising. Had reached her chest, her shoulders, and Lucas understood with perfect clarity that in approximately 90 seconds, this woman would drown. Someone behind him was shouting something about emergency services, about waiting for professionals. Lucas didn't wait. He kicked off his boots. They were good boots, expensive by his standards, purchased 3 years ago when he still thought things might get better, and dove. The water was so cold it felt like being stabbed. Lucas surfaced, gasped, and swam toward the sinking jet. The current fought him. His clothes dragged him down. His lungs burned with effort and ice, but he kept swimming because somewhere in his mind was Layla's face, and somewhere deeper was the understanding that letting someone die when you might save them was a kind of death itself. He reached the jet just as water began covering the window. The woman inside saw him. Their eyes met through the cracked glass. Lucas didn't think. Thinking would have told him this was impossible, that he wasn't strong enough, wasn't brave enough, wasn't enough. He grabbed a piece of broken metal jutting from the fuselage and slammed it against the window once, twice, 3 times, until the glass finally gave way. Water rushed in. The woman gasped, choked, and Lucas grabbed her arm and pulled. She was heavier than he expected, unconscious now from lack of oxygen, and the jet was sinking faster, the tail rising like an accusing finger pointing at the sky. Lucas wrapped one arm around the woman's chest and kicked toward the surface. His lungs screamed. Black spots danced in his vision. For a moment, just a flicker, he thought about letting go, about how easy it would be to just stop fighting and sink down into the cold quiet. Then he thought about Layla asking what he did today, and his legs found strength they shouldn't have had. They broke the surface together. Lucas gasped air that tasted like life and chemicals and the city's industrial breath. Hands reached down from a boat. Someone had gotten a boat, he didn't know who, didn't care, and pulled them out. The woman coughed up river water and bile. Lucas lay on his back in the bottom of the boat and stared at the gray sky and shook. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Lucas sat in a waiting room wearing clothes someone had given him, 3 sizes too large and smelling of cigarette smoke and laundry detergent. His own clothes were somewhere in a plastic bag, ruined by the river. His phone, also ruined, sat in his wet jacket pocket, a rectangular brick of useless technology. He couldn't call Layla's school, couldn't tell them he'd be late picking her up. The panic of that rose in his throat like bile. A nurse appeared. She was young, tired-looking, with kind eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Garcia, the woman you saved. She's asking for you." Lucas followed her down hallways that all looked the same, past rooms where people dealt with their own catastrophes in private. They stopped at a door. The nurse knocked, opened it, and Lucas stepped into a world he'd only ever seen on television. The woman sat upright in bed, IV in her arm, her dark hair now dry and pulled back. She looked different than she had in the river, composed, powerful. She wore a hospital gown but somehow made it look like she'd chosen it. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent, calculating, fixed on Lucas with an intensity that made him want to step backward. "Sit," she said. Not asked. Said. Lucas sat. "You saved my life," the woman continued. Her voice was hoarse from the river water, but steady. "I'm Susan Devon. I own Devon Capital. We manage $40 billion in assets across 17 countries. I employ 3,000 people. I sit on 5 boards. I was flying to a meeting that would have secured a deal worth $600 million. And today, none of that mattered. Today, I would have drowned in that river, if not for you." She paused. Lucas said nothing. He didn't know what Devon Capital was, or what managing $40 billion meant in practical terms. Those numbers belonged to a language he didn't speak. Susan reached for a glass of water, drank, and continued. "I want to do something for you. Money. A job. A house. Name it." Lucas thought about rent, about Layla's inhaler prescription that cost $80 even with insurance, about his truck that needed new brakes, and the contractor who still hadn't paid him, and the 1,000 small desperations that made up his life. "I don't want anything," he heard himself say. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Everyone wants something." "I did what anyone would do." Her voice turned sharp. 20 people stood on that riverbank. "You were the only one who jumped. That has value. Let me repay it." Lucas stood. "I need to pick up my daughter from school." He walked out before Susan could say anything else. Later, he would wonder why. Later, he would examine that moment the way you examine a photograph of yourself from years ago, trying to understand who that person was and what they were thinking. In the moment, though, all he knew was that accepting something felt dangerous in a way he couldn't articulate. He borrowed a phone from the nurse's station and called Layla's school. They'd waited with her. She was fine. He took a bus across the city. His truck was still downtown, keys probably at the bottom of the river, and arrived 40 minutes late. Layla ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, and Lucas felt something break and rebuild inside his chest. That night, after Layla was asleep, Lucas stood at his kitchen window and stared at the city lights. On the television, which he'd left on for noise, a news anchor was talking about the crash. They showed footage of the rescue. Lucas watched himself, a small figure in paint-stained clothes, dive into the river. The anchor called him a hero. The word felt foreign, like trying on someone else's shoes. His phone rang. Not his ruined phone. A new one that had appeared at his door an hour ago with a note that said simply, "So you can call if you change your mind. CW." Lucas didn't answer it. 3 days passed. Lucas painted walls and picked up Layla from school and made oatmeal for breakfast and pretended everything was normal. The news cycle moved on. The story became a footnote, then a memory, then nothing. Life insisted on continuing, indifferent to heroics and near deaths and all the drama humans tried to inject into it. On the 4th day, someone knocked on his door. Not a timid knock. Not a neighbor borrowing sugar knock. A knock that meant business. Lucas opened the door. Susan Devon stood in the hallway wearing a coat and an expression that suggested she was used to getting her way. Behind her stood a man in a suit, holding a briefcase. "You didn't call," Susan said. "I told you. I know what you told me. I don't care." She walked past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. The man with the briefcase followed. Lucas stood in his own doorway, unsure whether to be angry or impressed. Susan looked around the apartment. Her gaze cataloged everything. The cracked ceiling, the space heater in the corner, Layla's coat hanging by the door, with the torn pocket Lucas kept meaning to fix. Her face revealed nothing. "I've spent the last 3 days," Susan said, "learning everything about you. Lucas Garcia, 34 years old. Widowed 3 years ago. Daughter named Layla, 7 years old. Mild asthma. You work as a house painter. You make approximately $32,000 a year. Though last year, you made less because you missed 6 weeks of work, when Layla had pneumonia. You're 3 months behind on rent. Your truck needs $800 in repairs you can't afford. You have $412 in your bank account and $17 in cash. You owe the hospital $2,347 from Layla's last emergency room visit. Lucas felt something hot and humiliating rise in his throat. You had no right. I had every right. You saved my life. That makes you my responsibility. Susan opened the briefcase. Inside were papers, official-looking things with signatures and seals. I'm offering you a job, head of building operations at my personal estate. Salary of $120,000 a year. Full health insurance, the good kind that actually covers things. Housing included, a cottage on the property, 2 bedrooms renovated last year. There's a good school nearby where Layla can enroll. The numbers swam in Lucas's head. $120,000. That was more than 3 times what he made now. That was health insurance without copays and deductibles that might as well be ransom demands. That was Layla's prescriptions, without having to choose between medicine and groceries. I don't need, Lucas said. Susan's voice turned sharp. Don't perform false modesty, Lucas. It's insulting to both of us. You need this. Layla needs this. Take it. Lucas looked at the papers. The numbers seemed impossible, like they belonged to someone else's life. What's the catch? Susan smiled, and it was the first time Lucas had seen her smile. It didn't reach her eyes. No catch. Just work hard, be honest, and let me fix the imbalance between us. He should have asked more questions, should have read the fine print, should have done a dozen things that practical people do when offered opportunities that seem too good. Instead, he thought about Layla coughing in the night and the space heater that barely worked and the constant math of survival that occupied his brain like an invading army. Okay, he said. The cottage was perfect. That was Lucas's first thought when Susan drove them there the following week. Not just nice or adequate, perfect. 2 bedrooms with actual doors that closed, a kitchen with appliances that all worked simultaneously, windows that didn't whistle when the wind blew. Layla ran through the rooms making delighted sounds, while Lucas stood in the center of the living room and tried to remember how to breathe. Susan's main house loomed in the distance, a sprawling structure of glass and stone that looked more like a museum than a home. The estate covered 12 acres. There were gardens, a greenhouse, a pool house, and buildings whose purposes Lucas couldn't immediately identify. His job, Susan explained, was to oversee it all. Maintenance, repairs, coordinating with contractors, managing the small staff who kept everything running. I need someone I can trust, someone who won't steal from me or cut corners, or think I'm too busy to notice when things aren't done right. You've proven you don't quit when things get hard. That's rare, Susan said, reading his expression. The first month passed in a blur. Lucas learned the systems, met the staff, discovered which parts of the estate needed constant attention and which could be left alone. Layla enrolled in the nearby school and came home with stories about art class and a friend named Sophie who had a rabbit. She coughed less. The medication they could now afford made a difference Lucas could hear. Susan was rarely there. She traveled constantly, appeared in the main house for a few days at a time, then vanished again to Tokyo or London or Dubai. When she was present, she was all business, crisp, efficient, treating Lucas with professional courtesy that never quite crossed into warmth. But sometimes, late in the evening, Lucas would see her walking the grounds alone. She moved differently then, slower, less certain, like someone who'd forgotten how to simply exist without a purpose driving them forward. 3 months in, Lucas began noticing things. The mail that arrived at the main house, catalogs and invitations to galas and charity events, went unopened. Susan's refrigerator, which he checked once a week to remove expired items, contained mostly wine and takeout containers. The photographs throughout the house were all landscapes or abstract art. No people, no family, No evidence that anyone lived there who had connections to other humans. The main house had 7 bedrooms. Susan used one. It happened on a Tuesday in November. Lucas was doing a final check of the greenhouse before heading home. Layla was with a babysitter, a kind older woman named Mrs. Gwen, who lived nearby and seemed to genuinely enjoy Layla's company. The greenhouse was Susan's pet project, though she rarely visited it. Inside grew orchids of impossible colors, plants Lucas couldn't name, a small garden of beauty that no one really saw. He heard crying, not loud, not dramatic, just soft, broken sounds coming from the corner near the violet orchids. Lucas froze. He should leave, should pretend he hadn't heard. But the sound was so raw, so painfully human, that his feet carried him forward before his brain could stop them. Susan sat on the floor, back against the glass wall, knees pulled to her chest. She'd been crying long enough that her face was blotchy and her eyes were swollen. In her hand was a photograph. Even from several feet away, Lucas could see it showed a young girl, maybe 12 years old, with Susan's eyes and a smile that suggested she believed the world was basically good. Susan looked up, saw him, didn't bother pretending to compose herself. Susan's voice was scraped raw. "My daughter, Charlotte, died 6 years ago. Leukemia, 17 months from diagnosis to..." She stopped, swallowed. To the end. Lucas sat down on the floor across from her, said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. "I thought I could buy her more time," Susan continued. "Best doctors, best hospitals, best everything. I spent $4 million trying to save her. $4 million. And it didn't matter. Money can't buy everything, it turns out. It can't buy the thing that matters most." She laughed, but it was a terrible sound. "After she died, I threw myself into work, built the company bigger, made more money, proved I was still valuable, still necessary. And then I almost drowned in that river, and I realized," her voice broke, "I realized I didn't have a single person to call, no one who would care if I lived or died, beyond what it meant for stock prices. I've spent 6 years building an empire and forgot to build a life." Lucas thought about his own grief. The hole Hina's death had left. The way he'd almost drowned in it before Layla pulled him back to shore with her need and her love and her refusal to let him disappear into sorrow. "You didn't forget," Lucas said quietly. "You survived the only way you knew how." Susan looked at him. Really looked, maybe for the first time since they'd met. "Why did you turn down my money? That first day in the hospital. You clearly needed it. Why walk away?" Lucas considered the question. He'd asked himself the same thing dozens of times. "Because," he said slowly, "accepting it felt like it would change what happened. Like it would make the rescue a transaction instead of just..." He struggled for words. "Instead of just one person helping another person because that's what you do." "That's stupid," Susan said. "Probably." Susan smiled. It was small and broken, but real. "Thank you," she said, "for that day, and for not leaving just now when you heard me crying." They sat in the greenhouse for another hour. Susan talked about Charlotte, her laugh, her obsession with horses, the way she'd understood calculus at age 10 but couldn't remember to tie her shoes. Lucas talked about Hina, her terrible cooking, her habit of singing off-key in the shower, the way she'd made him feel like life was an adventure worth taking. When they finally left, something had shifted between them. Not romance, nothing so simple or neat, just recognition. Two people who'd lost what they couldn't afford to lose and were still figuring out how to live with the loss. Winter arrived. Layla thrived. Lucas settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in years, sustainable. Susan was around more often, and slowly, incrementally. The main house began showing signs of life. Flowers appeared in vases. Music played from speakers. Once, Lucas saw Susan laughing on the phone, and the sound was so unexpected, he stopped walking to listen. They began having dinner together once a week, Lucas and Layla and Susan, in the main house's enormous dining room. Layla would talk about school, and Susan would ask questions with genuine interest. Afterward, Susan would read to Layla chapter books about magic and adventure, while Lucas cleaned up. It was domestic and strange and surprisingly comfortable. One evening in late December, Lucas's phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Lucas Garcia?" A woman's voice, professional, slightly wary. "Yes?" "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm a private investigator." "I need to speak with you about Susan Devon." Lucas's stomach dropped. "What about her?" "Not over the phone. Can we meet?" They met the next day at a coffee shop downtown. Jennifer was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with the exhausted competence of someone who'd seen too many people at their worst. She laid a folder on the table between them. "I was hired 6 months ago," Jennifer said, "by Susan's former business partner. He suspected she was engaging in financial fraud, moving money around, creating shell companies, hiding assets." Lucas felt cold. And I found nothing. Susan's clean. But I found something else." Jennifer opened the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, timelines. The jet crash. It wasn't an accident. The words didn't make sense. Lucas stared at her. "Someone tampered with the maintenance records," Jennifer continued. "The engines were flagged for service 2 months before the crash. The work was never done, but the records say it was. The mechanic who signed off on it doesn't exist. His credentials are fake. Someone wanted that jet to fail. Who? That's what I've been trying to figure out. But here's what I know. The pilot died in the crash. Susan was supposed to die too. And if she had, her shares in Devon Capital, 67%, would have defaulted to her business partner under the terms of their original agreement." Lucas's mind raced. Her business partner wanted her dead. Wanted. Past tense. He died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack. Legitimate this time. I checked. Jennifer leaned forward. "But here's the thing I can't figure out. Susan knows. She has to know. She's too smart not to have investigated the crash herself. Yet she's done nothing. No police report, no private prosecution, nothing. It's like she wants to pretend it was just bad luck." After Jennifer left, Lucas sat in his truck for a long time. The pieces assembled themselves in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. That night, after Layla was asleep, Lucas walked to the main house. Susan was in her study, surrounded by papers and laptop screens glowing with spreadsheets and market analyses. Lucas said without preamble, "You knew about the crash, about your partner trying to kill you." Susan's hand stilled on her keyboard. She didn't look up. "Who told you?" "Does it matter?" "No." She closed her laptop. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you go to the police?" Susan was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Because he was Charlotte's godfather. Because he held her hand in the hospital and cried when she died. Because proving what he did would have meant dragging his family through hell, his wife, his children who had nothing to do with it. Because I was tired, Lucas. Tired of fighting and winning and losing the things that actually mattered." She stood, walked to the window, stared out at the dark grounds. "When I was in that river," she continued, "drowning, I felt relief. Just for a second, but it was there. Relief that it would be over. That I could stop pretending I knew how to keep living when Charlotte was gone. And then you pulled me out. You saved me, and I was angry." Lucas felt something twist in his chest. "Not at you," Susan said quickly. "At myself. Because I realized I'd been dead anyway, walking around, making money, building things, but completely dead inside. You gave me back my life, and I didn't know what to do with it. "So you tried to buy me," Lucas said. "No, I tried to save you back, because you were drowning too, Lucas. Different water, but drowning all the same. And maybe if I saved you, it would balance something. Make sense of why I survived when Charlotte didn't." The truth were complicated and uncomfortable. "It wasn't about the money," Susan said. "Not really. It was about," she struggled, "about not being alone in the dark anymore." Lucas thought about the past few months, the dinners, the conversations, the way Susan had slowly become part of his and Layla's life, not as a benefactor or employer, but as something more difficult to define. Family wasn't the right word. Friend wasn't big enough. Just someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep walking anyway. The next morning, Lucas found Susan in the greenhouse. She was repotting an orchid, dirt under her fingernails, hair tied back, looking more human than he'd ever seen her. "I want to show you something," she said. They drove into the city, to a building Lucas didn't recognize. Inside was a space being renovated, walls half-painted, floors being refinished, windows letting in winter light that made everything look possible. "I'm opening a foundation," Susan said, "in Charlotte's name, for families dealing with childhood illness. Not just money, though there'll be that too, but support, counseling, practical help with the things that fall apart when you're spending every day in a hospital. Transportation, meals, sibling care. The things no one thinks about until they need them." She turned to Lucas. "I want you to help me run it. Not the money part. I've got people for that. But the actual work, the talking to families, understanding what they need, making sure it's real and not just another wealthy person's tax write-off. Why me? Because you've been there. Because you know what it's like to be terrified and exhausted and trying to keep it together for your child. Because you didn't jump in that river for recognition or reward. You jumped because it was right. That's the kind of person I need." Lucas looked around the space, imagined it filled with people finding help when they most needed it, imagined being part of something that caught families before they drowned. He did want it. The realization surprised him. For 3 years, he'd been surviving. Just barely. Just enough. Now Susan was offering him the chance to do more than survive, to take his own drowning and turn it into a lifeline for others. Lucas agreed. Susan smiled. It was the real one, the one that reached her eyes. "Good. Because I already hired a contractor and told him you'd be overseeing the work." The foundation opened in April. They called it Charlotte's Light, and within 6 months, they were helping 40 families. Within a year, 200. The work was hard, emotionally draining, often heartbreaking. But it was also real in a way Lucas's life hadn't been for a long time. Layla grew taller, stronger, healthier. She and Susan developed a relationship that Lucas didn't entirely understand, but recognized as valuable. Susan taught her chess and told her stories about business and travel. Layla made Susan laugh in ways that seemed to surprise them both. One evening, Lucas found them in the greenhouse together, Susan showing Layla how to check the soil moisture on the orchids. They were debating whether plants could feel affection. Layla arguing yes with 7-year-old certainty. Susan playing devil's advocate, but clearly charmed. "You know what Charlotte would have loved about you," Susan said to Layla. "You believe things can be better. Even when they're hard, you think they can improve. She had that too. I'd forgotten how good it is." Layla considered this seriously. "Do you still get sad after Charlotte died?" "Yes, but differently now. Because we're here." Susan looked at Lucas over Layla's head, and something passed between them. Understanding. Gratitude. The recognition of how randomly lives intersect and change each other. "Yes," Susan said, "because you're here." On the 1-year anniversary of the crash, Lucas and Susan stood on the riverbank where it had happened. The city had installed a small plaque commemorating the event. It called Lucas a hero, which still made him uncomfortable. "I've been thinking," Susan said, "about that day. What you said in the hospital about not wanting to make it a transaction. Still think it was stupid?" "No. I think you understood something I didn't. That the value wasn't in the act itself, but in what it meant. Not the rescue, but the choosing to rescue. The deciding that someone else's life mattered more than your own safety." Lucas thought about the past year, about Layla's laughter and Susan's foundation and the families they'd helped. About how sometimes saving someone's life was the beginning of a story, not the end of one. About how the people we pull from drowning sometimes pull us back in return. "We saved each other," he said. Susan smiled. They stood there for a while longer, watching the river flow past, indifferent, eternal, carrying away the old life so the new one could begin. Behind them, the city hummed with its millions of private catastrophes and quiet victories. Somewhere in that noise was Layla at her friend's house, laughing about something only 7-year-olds found funny. Somewhere was the foundation office, where tomorrow they'd meet with 3 new families who needed help. Somewhere was the cottage where Lucas would make dinner tonight, and Susan would probably join them. And they'd talk about ordinary things in the extraordinary life they'd accidentally built together. The jet was long gone. The heroic moment had passed. What remained was harder and better than any single act of rescue. The daily choice to stay above water, to reach for others when they were sinking, to believe that lives could be saved, not just once, in dramatic river rescues, but over and over, in small ways that added up to everything. Lucas had pulled Susan from drowning. Susan had pulled him from a different kind of drowning. And together, they were pulling others. Not because it made them heroes or balanced some cosmic ledger, but because once you've been underwater and felt hands reach down to save you, you can't help but do the same. That was the real twist. Not that a billionaire rewarded her rescuer, but that both of them discovered they needed rescuing. That money couldn't solve everything, but human connection could solve what money couldn't touch. That sometimes the person you save saves you right back, and sometimes the greatest gift isn't wealth or opportunity, but simply someone who sees you drowning and refuses to look away.